You. What'd you say? It's just everything that you see on the board from here to the end of the screen is being recorded. What? No, it's on the board. Everything on the board is being recorded. All right. So this test tomorrow. Let's all focus up here, please. This test tomorrow is going to be purely on the brain, right? Naming the structures and being able to explain what their function is, all right? A couple extra pieces of information that you need to know that we went over, all right? First of all, when we are looking at the brain, right, we looked at two different types of matter composing the brain, right? One of them is gray matter, and the other one is white matter. Which one of those two did we describe as the type of tissue that is processing information? The gray matter, right? So the gray matter is where all of the thinking takes place, or it's where all the information processing is taking place within the brain. When we look at the white matter in the brain, it's made up mostly of fat, and we describe the white matter as like the highways within the brain. So it's where all the information travels. So they're like highways of information within the brain. When we are looking at the cerebrum, we said that the cerebrum is convoluted. In other words, the cerebrum is highly folded, right? And the reason why the cerebrum is folded is that it increases the total amount of what? Surface area, right? It's all about increasing surface area of the brain. And that should make sense to you because we said that thinking occurs on the outermost parts of the brain. So the more surface area the brain has, the more thinking can take place, or the smarter you are. What did we say was on the outer edges, the gray matter or the white matter? The gray matter. So the reason why the brain is folded is to increase the surface area, or you would say to increase the total amount of gray matter, which is where all of that thinking takes place. Does that make sense to all of you guys? When we look at the folds, we have names for the bumps and the grooves. The bumps are called gyri, right, or gyrus singular. That is the bump. And a sulcus is the groove. All right, so you have gyri and sulci, which are the bumps and the grooves, increasing the surface area of the cerebrum. So now we get into the actual nitty-gritty, the different parts of the brain. So the part of the brain that we started with is this whole outermost region, this region that is folded, and this entire region from here to here we refer to as being the cerebrum. Let me know if I start moving too fast for everybody. So when we looked at the cerebrum, we studied the idea of localization. Localization is the idea that different parts of the brain are responsible for performing different functions. Right? Different parts of the brain are responsible for performing different functions. So with this idea of localization, we can take the cerebrum and break it up into 4 different lobes. So the first lobe that we learned is right here, if I outline it. This massive lobe of the human brain is called the frontal lobe. Does anybody remember the name of this sulcus that divided the frontal lobe from the lobe behind it? We went over. What did you say, Chloe? A C. Not the corpus callosum. Not the cerebellum. No. All right. This line right here. Second letter is CE. It's called the central sulcus. The central sulcus right there. And everything from the central sulcus forward is the frontal lobe. So the frontal lobe performs a lot of different functions. So I just kind of want to make a list on the right here. Right, we said the frontal lobe performs all of the really important functions that make us human, that make us who we are. Things like our personality. Things like decision making. Things like reasoning. Things like abstract thinking. Right? We talked about impulse control. All of these things that are kind of uniquely human, they are all found within this frontal lobe. Right? Now, there is one particular part of the frontal lobe that we studied. It is this part right here, outlined in red. Right here. It is the very last part of the frontal lobe. I could even highlight it in this brain right here. It would be this. The very last part of the frontal lobe is called the motor cortex. The motor cortex is where all what gets generated? Movement. Good. So the motor cortex is where movement is generated. And that motor cortex is the very back of the frontal lobe. Go ahead, Aaron.
Well, we need to know what the central sulcus does.
It's a sulcus, so it's a.
What part of, like,
what you should know is that it is a groove. This is a sulcus, right?
Yeah.
And it's the groove that is separating the frontal lobe from the lobe behind it. That's the only thing that you need to know. It doesn't have any unique function. It's just the way that we separate out the brain. So the lobe right behind the frontal lobe, right here, this lobe right here is called the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe is one that we spent a lot of time talking about. Who remembers what the parietal lobe does? Yeah, like body positioning. Remember? Your sense of self in space. We talked about my favorite disorder called hemi-neglect. And all remember we talked like a half an hour about it? Right? We said that the parietal lobe controls your understanding of where you are in space. You know where your arms are. You know where your legs are. You know your body positioning. You know your body awareness because of your parietal lobe, right? Your sense of self in space, your own body positioning. Now, we talked about one specific part of the parietal lobe. It's the very, very front of the parietal lobe, which is shown right here. in blue. So this is the very front of the parietal lobe. And we call this the somatosensory cortex. Or, if you would like, you could just call it the sensory cortex. And this is where your sense of what comes into play? Touch. Good, touch. Right? So your sensory cortex is what gives you a sense of touch. Right? That is all in the sensory or the somatosensory cortex. Right? And again, that is the very front of your parietal lobe. So again, if you're looking at this top picture, it would be right here. Right? This would be your somatosensory cortex. So your sensory cortex and your motor cortex are separated by your central sulcus. Do we all see that? All right, good. Behind the parietal lobe is the easiest lobe in the back of the brain right here. And we call this the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe only does one thing. What does your occipital lobe do? Sight, vision. Vision takes place in your occipital lobe. Am I moving too fast or are we okay? Keep it moving? All right. The last lobe of your cerebrum is the lobe that is on the side of your brain, right here. And we call this your temporal lobe. And we learned that your temporal lobe gives you a number of different sensations. For example, smell and taste both take place within your temporal lobe. So you have a lot of sensations happening.
Isn't touch a sensation?
It is, but touch is not happening in your temporal lobe. So smell and taste is temporal. Touch is in the sensory cortex specifically. Good question. All right, so those are the four lobes that compose your cerebrum. You have your frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, temporal lobe. Four lobes composing your cerebrum, and each lobe is responsible for performing different functions. Right, and that's the idea of localization. We learned about two other areas of the cerebrum that perform very, very specific functions. Towards the front of your brain right here, this region is called Broca's area. And Broca's area is where what gets produced? Yeah, speech or language. So speech is produced in Broca's area, towards the front of the brain. It's actually part of your frontal lobe. Speech is produced. This region right here in the back of your brain, we call this Wernicke's area. And Wernicke's area is where speech is understood. Or you could say language is understood in Wernicke's area. So when we learned these two regions, we said they were interesting because the production of speech and the understanding of language take place in two different parts of the brain, two distinct regions within the brain. Are we all doing okay so far?
Is that in your parietal?
That's your parietal lobe right there, yeah. It's your parietal lobe. It's kind of like, verging on your parietal and your temporal, kind of like in that area right there. Below your cerebrum is this structure right here. Right? This is below the cerebrum. This is not part of your cerebrum. This region right here is called your cerebellum. Okay? So please remember that your cerebellum is not part of your cerebrum. Your cerebellum is below your cerebrum. It is a separate brain structure.
Do we have to know where that's broken or where it's part of the temporal?
No. You should be able to identify them and tell what they do. The cerebellum is responsible for balance and coordination. Balance, right? Your sense of balance, your sense of coordination, they all take place within your cerebellum. All right. Let's go to these three areas right here. So you have three regions. We have this 1, 2, 3. All right, just because I can't fit it right there. Number 1 is your medulla. 2 is your pons. 3 is your midbrain. Your medulla, pons, and midbrain. From the bottom up, medulla, pons, midbrain. And these three structures make up what we call your brainstem. And we said that your brainstem does all of your automatic functions, things that you are not in control of, things like your heart rate, things like your blood pressure, things like your breathing rate. These are all things that are taking place in your brain stem, things that you cannot exert any control over whatsoever. They're all brain stem. All right, we're doing well. We're almost there. Time to move deep into the center of the brain. First, if you're looking at the middle of the brain here, we have the bridge between the left and the right hemisphere. Does anybody remember what that bridge is called? Somebody said it before. The corpus callosum. That's this structure right here, the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum. We said that the corpus callosum is the bridge between the left and the right hemisphere. Do you remember us talking about each person having a dominant hemisphere? We said most people who are right-handed, their left hemisphere is dominant. Right? And we said the corpus callosum is the bridge that allows those two hemispheres to communicate. Do you think your corpus callosum is more gray matter or white matter?
White.
It's all white, right? Is your corpus callosum doing anything in particular? No, it's just allowing the two sides to communicate. So it's all white matter. Right below your corpus callosum is the most important brain structure of all time. It is a circle in the middle of your brain. I drew my circle too big. Right? The most important of all brain structures, period, and that is the thalamus. We said that your thalamus is like your brain's master computer. It controls all routing of information. So it's going to control all information flow. Right? It's going to control all movement of information. If you remember these terms, we said that all sensory input into the brain first goes through the thalamus. All motor output leaving the brain first goes through the thalamus. Any information going from one part of the brain to another part of the brain first goes through the thalamus. And the thalamus controls where all information goes. Can you survive without an intact thalamus? Absolutely not. It is the most critical of all brain structures. Right below the thalamus, right here, is another super important structure, which is called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, we said, maintains homeostasis, or is also considered your brain's want center. Meaning, it is the part of your brain that makes you feel hungry. It is the part of your brain that'll make you feel thirsty. It's the part of the brain that maintains your body temperature. Right? The hypothalamus is all about maintaining your internal environment, keeping it regulated. Right below the hypothalamus is this little punching bag right there. And this punching bag is called the pituitary gland. We learned that your pituitary gland is your master gland, controlling all of your body's what? Hormones. Good. Right? It's controlling all of the hormones within your body. Really important part of the endocrine system. But your pituitary controls all of the hormones in the body. We're almost there. You guys are doing a fantastic job. Two more brain structures that are not on these pictures. You're not going to have to identify them, but you have to describe their functions. You can't see them in these pictures. One is the amygdala. The amygdala. We learned that the amygdala is a deep brain structure that controls primitive emotion, like fear, anger, right? Fear and anger all take place within the amygdala. If you remember, the amygdala is the part of the brain that triggers the fight or flight response, right? In response to something stressful. It's going to make you afraid, make you angry. The amygdala starts fight or flight. Last brain structure, the hippocampus. Good. Hippocampus. And the hippocampus, super important, deep brain structure, is where short-term memory is stored. Short-term memory stored in the hippocampus. Now, if we look at all these deep brain structures, you have the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the pituitary, the amygdala, in the hippocampus. And you put all of these deep brain structures together. This deep region right here. We call this the diencephalon. Or we also call it the limbic system. Right? That region is generally referred to as the diencephalon. It's containing the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the pituitary, the amygdala, the hippocampus. Is the diencephalon or the limbic system. All right, that's everything.
So what's